Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch. As you can see, I'm on the road, so you're going to get a show that's a little bit different than you usually get. I'm on the way to Texas from Virginia. As some of you may know, I grew up in Texas and have spent a large part of my life there, and so I'm going back to spend some Thanksgiving holidays with siblings and their families. And so I want to share some thoughts with you on what's going on with President Trump and his administration, which is what this show is all about. Some of you may notice there in the background my Princess Cassie. She's my golden retriever, and she is a genuine princess, and she travels with me on all my road trips, and she's a great traveling companion. So let's begin with Ukraine. There's peace negotiations taking place with respect to settling that war that has been so highly destructive. And President Trump is now trying to pressure Ukraine into agreeing to terms that the mainstream press says essentially incorporate most everything that Russia wants as part of the settlement. And Ukrainian President Zelensky's resisting that. The European allies in this are totally left out of the process. They're just sort of standing on the outside, looking in, providing some commentary, but they're not enthusiastic about it. But Zelensky's under a lot of pressure by Trump, as well as the circumstances on the battlefield. Military analysts are saying it's just a matter of time. I mean, Russia's taken huge losses, but just a matter of time before they break through and probably make it all the way to Kiev and take over the country. So Trump is telling Zelensky, you need to agree to this, and he's put pressure on him, and he's saying, that Ukraine's not expressing enough gratitude, and that he's intimating that Ukraine started the war. In other words, he's reverting back to that White House meeting, where they upbraided, he and Vance, Vice President Vance, upbraided Zelensky for not wearing a suit, saying that he had started the war and so forth. But what we have to remember in this, and this is critically important for libertarians to continue emphasizing, because you're not going to get this in the mainstream press, you're not going to get it among the Democrats or the Republicans, and that is that the role that the U.S. national security establishment has played in provoking this conflict. And when I use the national security state, it's another word for the deep state. That's my definition of the deep state, the national security state. I'm referring to the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. This is a dark, evil force within the U.S. government. A lot of Americans don't realize this. They see this force as something good, a force for good in the world. It's the exact opposite. And it's important that libertarians emphasize this, because we're never going to get a free society as long as we have this national security state. It is the opposite of a free society. And part of its job, as it sees it, is to create an endless series of conflicts, crises, even crises that can easily lead to all-out nuclear war in order to justify its existence. Because the more conflicts, the more crises, people get afraid, and then the mainstream press says, who's going to protect us from Russia? Russia's going to take over the world again. Who's going to protect us? The national security establishment. How convenient. So we have to recognize the role that they played, and they're masters in creating these conflicts. I mean, we can see that in Venezuela. We'll talk about Venezuela in a minute, but remember, 6 months ago, there was no crisis in Venezuela.
Use the right two lanes to take exit 1B for I-40 West toward
Knoxville.
Lo
and behold, there's the crisis, which they created. They're masters at it. And after the fiasco in Afghanistan, 20-year war. Imagine, 20 years at war. Killing and destroying and all sorts of things, and saying, this is necessary for national security. National security killed untold numbers of people, sacrificed thousands of American troops, and then they get booted out. And before Americans can even get a sense of, let's reflect on what happened here, you got a new crisis in Ukraine. And what what's important to keep remembering about this and emphasizing is that they used NATO to provoke this conflict. After the end of the Cold War, which had been a big racket, the Cold War had been a big racket where, it comes out of the aftermath of World War II, and we got a new official enemy. They said, "Thank you very much for we defeated the Nazis, but you can't rest. We can't rest. We now are facing a new official enemy, who, by the way, had been our official partner and ally during the war, but now it's worse than Nazi Germany, and so we have to convert America to a national security state."
In half a mile, use the right 2 lanes to take exit 1B for I-40 West toward Knoxville.
So they know that they're losing their official enemy during the Cold War. This is their big racket. The Soviet Union's coming to get us. We need to convert to a national security state.
Use the right 2 lanes to take exit 1B.
And so that had been a racket for the entire Cold War period. It justified the existence of the whole national security establishment. And then all of a sudden they suddenly lose it. They lose their official enemy with the sudden end of the Cold War.
In half a mile, merge onto I-40.
And they're freaking out. They're freaking out because people are talking about a peace dividend. All of a sudden it's like, maybe we don't need it. Well, very few people were saying we don't need the national security state at all. It had become so deeply embedded in people's psyche. But I think over time, people would have started asking that question. The question that I asked today: what are we doing with a national security state if we want a free society?
Continue on I-40 for 3 miles.
Because they're opposites. And so what they did was they first proposed, we can get involved in the drug war, okay? Which is ironic because that's what they've done over here in the Caribbean. That's the military committing those assassinations over there. And that's what they were proposing when the Cold War ended, that they get involved in the Cold War, in the drug war, because there was no official enemy. But they never lost sight of the possibility that they could get Russia back as an official enemy, because it had been proven such a gold mine for them. Also, Red China. They needed to make Red China another official enemy too, and so that was the quest. How do we get these people back as official enemies and get the American people all riled up and stuff? So the diplomats promised the Soviet Union, the Russians, the Soviet Union was dismantling, we won't expand NATO eastward. NATO will just stay where it is. Well, okay, why was that important to Russia? It was because they knew that the national security state that was coming into existence would be a very aggressive dark force within the United States. They understood that. They're a national security state. And they knew that a national security state would be a threat to their existence, a U.S. national security state. And that was what the whole Cold War was all about. The Russians are coming, so the aggression, in large part, was the U.S. government. I mean, you saw that in Cuba. Cuba never attacked the United States, has never attacked the United States. And yet Cuba's portrayed as this enemy force, official enemy of the U.S., when it's been the U.S. government that's always been the aggressor. State-sponsored assassinations, at least attempts, repeated attempts, acts of terrorism, sanctions, embargoes, against a nation that's never attacked the United States. So the Russians were right that the national security establishment is a grave threat to any nation in terms of its aggressiveness. When you look at
keep left to stay on I-40.
The number of people that the U.S. national security state has killed, since it was converted to a national security state, it's got a number in the millions. When you add it all up, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Afghanistan, Iraq.
Keep left to stay on I-40.
All the sanctions, the embargoes, it's got to add up into the millions. So
continue on I-40 for 50 miles.
So the Russians were interested in stopping NATO in its tracks, because NATO's always been controlled by the U.S. national security state. It still is. And so the Pentagon uses NATO to fulfill its purposes, as well as the CIA and the NSA. Well, NATO should have just dismantled at the end of World War II. I mean, that was its purpose, was to supposedly stop a Soviet invasion of Western Europe at the end of World War II, which was ridiculous because there was no possibility that was going to happen. I mean, Russia was totally devastated. The Soviet Union was devastated by Nazi Germany. Remember, Nazi Germany made it all the way into Russia, near Moscow and St. Petersburg. They came very close to conquering Russia, securing a surrender. And the Russian winter turned them around, turned the war around. But at the end of this thing, Russia had no industrial capacity. The thought that they were going to invade Western Europe, they were exhausted. Their whole nation had been destroyed by the Nazis. But we need NATO to protect Western Europe. It's nonsense. But at the very least, at the end of the Cold War, it should have gone out of business. But it didn't. And so Russia was worried. We don't want, U.S. nuclear missiles on our borders. We don't want you to keep moving eastward so you can put those missiles closer and closer. And of course, the U.S. mainstream press, they don't get this. They say, oh, the U.S. is a peace-loving nation. Oh, we would never do anything bad. Oh, my gosh. The U.S. national security establishment during the Kennedy administration presented Kennedy with a plan for a first strike nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, like a Pearl Harbor, a surprise nuclear attack. And their argument was, well, if we can knock out most of their nuclear facilities, they'll only get a few nuclear missiles off to the United States, and so
there are police reported ahead.
We'll still have, 30 or 40 million people left. They won't have anybody left. We'll win the war. That was the rationale. That caused Kennedy to leave this meeting with indignation and said, we call ourselves the human race. So the Russians were concerned about this, just like when the Soviets put nuclear missiles into Cuba. Remember how upset U.S. officials were, including Kennedy. And they said, no, you're not going to do this. But they had the right to do this, or the prerogative of doing this under international law. Cuba's an independent nation. Why shouldn't it have the right to have nuclear missiles there from the Soviet Union if it wants them, or from Russia? But as a practical matter, the U.S. said, no, well, we're not going to have nuclear missiles so close. Russia's attitude was the same way. Now, the mainstream press says, well, it's understandable the U.S. wouldn't want Russian nuclear missiles there because they're an aggressor nation. But it's not understandable for Russia to feel the same way about the U.S. because the U.S. is a peace-loving nation as a national security state. The Pentagon's a peace-loving nation and so forth. Well, it's ridiculous. So U.S. diplomats understood Russia's position and said, we give you our word. NATO will stay in existence, but we won't expand. But almost immediately it started expanding, and there's no doubt it's the national security state, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, that trump the vow, the promises of the diplomats, because in this governmental structure, it's the U.S. national security state that's in control. So they start using NATO to start absorbing former members of the Warsaw Pact, moving closer and closer to Russia's borders. And Russia kept saying,
there are police reported ahead.
You've got to stop. You've got to stop. Year after year, you've got to stop. If you get to Ukraine and you're gonna threaten to put these nuclear weapons along with tanks and troops and everything on our borders, we're going to invade. We're going to stop this. And so Afghanistan turns out to be a fiasco. The U.S. national security establishment gets kicked out after huge loss of life, death, destruction. But they had the trigger ready to go. So the Americans wouldn't even get a chance to reflect on what had happened in Afghanistan. They'd pull the trigger and say, well, we're going to go ahead and absorb Ukraine into NATO. And that was the trigger that launched the war. Russia says, well, we told you we were going to do this. We've been telling you this for years. And of course they knew it. That was how Biden knew that Russia was going to invade. He thought, he was saying, we've got great intelligence, they're going to invade. It's pure nonsense. Russia told them that they were going to do this. Now, the average American didn't know this because average Americans have lives to live, they have families to raise. They're not going to keep up with everything Russia's saying. But that's what Russia was saying the whole time. And then, so Zelensky is there. I don't know how they got him to agree on this. There's no telling. Some kind of deal was made, because Zelensky then decides that he wants to join NATO, even though Russia told him we're going to invade. And what ruler of a country would say, I'm willing to trade that invasion, I'm willing to risk that invasion, which was no risk at all, it was a certainty, for the right to join NATO? I mean, this war is not about freedom. You know, they keep talking about in the mainstream press this is about freedom. No, it's not. Because the joining of NATO is not freedom, okay? But they got him to do this. So in order for Zelensky to get Ukraine to be part of NATO, he's lost, a large portion of his country, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. I think it's hundreds of thousands. I don't know what the exact number is, but massive devastation of the whole country just for the right to join NATO. But it was the U.S. national security establishment that provoked this war, and it wasn't the first time. If you look at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, I think it was in '79. The U.S. provoked that one too. And we know that, you can say, oh, conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory, which, a lot of the statists always bring up. But Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I think had been national security advisor, he admitted it later on. He gave an interview saying, yeah, we provoked him into doing it. He says it was a great victory. We gave them their own Vietnam. That's what the phrase he used. And, of course, that meant Soviet soldiers getting killed. Regular Soviet soldiers. Soldiers have families. It's not just American soldiers that have families. Soviet soldiers have families, have brothers, sisters, spouses, children, parents. And Brzezinski was celebrating that they were going to get killed. Okay, that's why he says, oh, this is great. We've given them their own Vietnam. And so I'm sure they were celebrating too when they got people's distracted away from the Afghanistan debacle to now this new thing of Russia the aggressor, oh, and so it was back. You see, they got their Cold War enemy back. Everybody was saying, oh, they're going to try to take over Eastern Europe and Western Europe. We're back to the Cold War. It's Cold War 2. And then they're going to come. The Russians are coming, like that movie from the Cold War, the Russians are coming. And you can read Scott Horton's great book, Provoked. I mean, Horton details everything that the U.S. was doing there through NATO to provoke this war. And so Russia's sitting there saying, how, in these peace negotiations, how do we assure ourselves that this isn't going to happen again? If I were Russia, if you were Russia, would you trust the U.S. if it says, okay, we give you our word that we settle this and we put it in writing that Ukraine will not join NATO? The U.S. violates agreements every day. I mean, they violated the agreement not to expand NATO. If you're Russia, do you sit there and say, oh, we can trust these people not to break their word? This is a dark, evil force within the U.S. government. They're going to break any word they want. And so I don't know how Russia assures itself. The real solution to this war is dismantling NATO. Just get rid of it. It's a Cold War dinosaur. It's another evil, dark force. Dismantle it, and now Russia says, okay, we don't have this possibility now anymore of NATO being used to put nuclear missiles here on our borders and so forth, because there's no NATO. But, that would satisfy Russia, but Putin knows that he's not going to be able to get that. There's no sense in even bringing it up. It would just send, Trump and the European allies into, Never Land, because he's proposing that they give up their beloved NATO. But I don't see how he's going to be assured. He's trying to do it in a different way, that by reducing the size of Ukraine's army. I don't see what that's going to accomplish, because if he wakes up one morning, Putin wakes up one morning, and all of a sudden there's all these NATO troops and there are U.S. troops in Ukraine, and they've secretly voted to make Ukraine part of NATO, and there they are, then what does Putin do at that point? I mean, invade again and start a all-out nuclear war, attacking U.S. troops in Ukraine? And he can say, well, you violated the agreement. Okay, so what? What's he going to do? Sue? So I don't see how they're going to satisfy what he is really concerned about. And ultimately, it's got to turn on, okay, we trust the U.S. to honor its commitment, but I wouldn't trust them 1 inch. So we'll see how this thing turns out. In any event, if we turn to Venezuela here, we can see how the aggressor works, because they've now concocted another crisis. This is what they do. This is what they were proposing to do at the end of the Cold War, and now they're killing these people in these boats. I mean, this is atrocious. Trying to justify it by with these ridiculous legal opinions from the Office of Legal Counsel. I mean, these are lawyers that have been told by Trump, come up with a justification, legal justification, and they stand up and salute and say, yes, sir. And so, as I wrote a recent blog, there's two kinds of lawyers. There's lawyers that have integrity and say, well, we're going to give you an opinion regardless of whether you like it or not. And they're independent-minded lawyers. They got integrity. But then there's other lawyers who say, oh, just tell us what you want. We'll figure out a legal justification for it. We'll come up with some authorities for it. Those are the lawyers that lack integrity. And this is the Office of Legal Counsel. They're going to do whatever Trump wants them to do in terms of justification. So they've come up with these ridiculous justifications. These are state-sponsored assassinations. That's all they are. And that's the role of the national security establishment, or one of the roles. Another role is regime change. But anything to justify its existence, crises, chaos, wars, provoking wars, going after regimes that you don't like, sanctions, embargoes, constant crisis, chaos, and whatever, so that people will say, oh, I have so much respect for the military. They're keeping us safe. They're keeping us safe. And President Eisenhower warned about this dark force. In his farewell address, he recognized that this was a revolutionary change in America's governmental structure. He justified it and said, well, we need it as part of the Cold War, which was pure nonsense. You don't fight evil with evil. But he said, Americans need to watch this thing. That he called it the military-industrial complex, same name for the deep state or the national security state. He was talking about the CIA, the NSA, the Pentagon, the vast military-industrial complex, and all the military bases, the foreign military bases, the domestic military bases. He says this is a grave threat to our democratic processes and to our freedoms in this country. And he's absolutely right. And so now they've got the authority, and part of this conversion was giving them the power of assassination, or relinquishing the power. It comes into existence de facto. The Constitution, of course, prohibits state-sponsored assassinations, just as it prohibits torture. But once you get a national security state, they wield these powers as a practical matter. Nobody's going to stop them. The courts can't, federal courts can't stop them. They don't have the way to enforce their orders. And so it's just a default. They can engage in state-sponsored assassinations, even though it clearly violates America's criminal system as well as our constitutional system. So these assassinations, that's what they are there. But that's what this national security state does. It assassinates people. No due process, no trial. And that's what the Kennedy assassination was all about. It was 62nd anniversary we just marked on November 22nd. Kennedy was the only president that took these people on, or this establishment on, the national security state. He took them on. It was a war. We've published this book at FFF called JFK's War with the National Security Establishment. He went to war with them. It was the same type of war that Chile's president, 10 years later, Salvador Allende, democratically elected socialist communist president, he went to war against the national security branch of his government. He lost too. They were firing missiles at his position during the middle of the war. Well, they didn't fire missiles at Kennedy, but they fired bullets at Kennedy. And yeah, I know what the mainstream press says, conspiracy theory, but I mean, it's been clearly established with that fraudulent autopsy. I wrote a book on the Kennedy autopsy. I invite you to read it if you never read it. It's a synopsis of Douglas Warren's masterpiece, watershed, breakthrough book called Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. Once you establish a fraudulent autopsy that the military conducted on Kennedy's body, that's it. It's over. Now, that's post-assassination, but that's how you know they were involved in the assassination itself. There is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. None. So once that was established, it's case closed. It's case over. But they won the war against Kennedy. No president since then has dared to take on the national security establishment. And so these assassinations in the Caribbean, it's just the same thing. They justify them on grounds of national security, that, well, these are narcos, they're smuggling drugs, and then they went further and said, oh, well, they're terrorists too. Really, where's the act of terrorism? You know, I don't see them firing missiles or bullets or bombs. I don't see them blowing up terrorist bombs in America and whatever. It's just a ruse to justify these assassinations. Oh, we're at war, we're at war. Really? At war? Where's the war? Where's the declaration of war from Congress? But they bring this huge military armada in, and it appears to be just a ruse to justify a regime change operation in Venezuela. I mean, you know, what would happen if Russia was off American shores on the high seas, shooting boats there, or let's say Venezuela was there, blowing out boats containing American citizens? I don't think the U.S. government would tolerate that for 1 minute. What if Russia started supplying Venezuela with missiles to fire at those boats out there in the Caribbean? Or in an event of a war, if Trump invades or attacks Venezuela, which will clearly be an act of war, he can say, well, no, we're attacking drug facilities. Those drug facilities are inside Russia, inside Venezuela. If Russia starts supplying weaponry like the U.S. is doing there, you know the mainstream press will go ballistic. Vice President Vance and President Trump will go ballistic. Oh my gosh, you can't do that, you can't do that. Which is precisely what they're doing in Ukraine, supplying Ukraine with weaponry. Well, then why doesn't Russia have the right, under that same reasoning, to supply weaponry to Venezuela, especially when the U.S. will be the aggressor? I mean, at least Russia has an excuse. You know, they got provoked by NATO. There'd be no excuse over here. U.S. is clearly the aggressor. And Trump, as I've pointed out, has wittingly or unwittingly gotten himself in a trap there. Because what does he do now? He can't leave that armada there forever. I think he was hoping that Maduro would just leave, that he could intimidate them with the B-52s and the USS Gerald Ford, that massive aircraft carrier, and that he could intimidate him, scare him. And then the CIA is operating there, which is clearly an act of war. You know, to send the CIA in there, which undoubtedly is looking for ways to assassinate Maduro. And so, you know, they're over there doing the same thing that they've accused Russia of doing. And if he attacks a drug facility, he's attacking the country. We got to keep in mind that every country's got the right to establish its own drug policy. You know, nobody died and made Trump the emperor, the king of the world, or the DEA or the military. If they want to legalize drugs, if they don't want to enforce the drug war in their countries, they don't have to. You look at Portugal. Portugal legalized drugs. They don't have a war against the drug cartels and so forth. There are no drug cartels there because drugs have been legalized. That's the way you get rid of the cartels. But regardless, if a country like Venezuela says, we're not going to enforce drugs, or they want to go into the drug business, that's their business. Nobody died and made the U.S. government the emperor of the world, but that's their attitude. Oh, we're going to drop bombs on your drug facilities because you don't have a right to produce drugs there in those cartels. Really? It's an independent country. They got a right to do whatever they want, or I should say prerogative of doing whatever they want with respect to their drug policies. And then, but if he attacks the drug facilities, he's attacking the country, but it still leaves Maduro in power. And that's clearly not what he wants. I mean, one of the funniest things when Maduro said, well, we'll meet face to face, and part of the deal that we strike is leave me in power for 2 to 3 more years. It's pretty funny because, you know, he knows that 2 or 3 years from now he'll just start negotiating again. Well, Trump wouldn't have anything to do with that. He says, no, that's a non-starter. And Trump is smart enough to realize that. But you know, how are they going to meet face to face? I mean, Maduro's going to go to Washington? Come on. I mean, they'd kill him as soon as he gets there. Or they'd put him in chains. And Trump's going to go to Venezuela? Come on, give me a break. Not a chance. I mean, Maduro's not going to go out in a third country. Maduro's not that dumb. They'll have these CIA assassins ready to fire at him wherever he is. And so I think the whole face-to-face thing is a joke too. But what does Trump do? I mean, if Maduro doesn't leave, if he invades, there's no question about what the outcome of the war will be. I mean, the U.S. is the most powerful military machine in history, despite what the Taliban did to them. And Venezuela's been under sanctions for decades. There's no way that they have the capacity to resist the U.S. My hunch is that the Venezuelan military is going to surrender very quickly, and I think Maduro would come out dead. I don't think they're going to let him live, because then they'd have to bring him back to the United States and prove him guilty of violating U.S. drug laws, and that could be problematic. What if he's found not guilty by a jury? Then what? What does that do to what's happening in Venezuela? And then you know, what would be the situation in Venezuela? Impossible to predict. One of the funniest things was that the leader of the opposition, Maria Machado, she says, I'm ready to step in and take over. But she apparently forgot that she wasn't the one who was elected. This other guy who's in exile in Spain, I forget what his name is, he was the one elected president, at least legitimately. Maduro says that he won, but it's pretty clear that this other guy won. But Machado's there saying, oh, forget that election, just put me in charge. So we don't know how this whole thing's going to turn out, but I don't think it can stay indefinitely. I don't think they can leave those ships there indefinitely, those B-52s flying overhead and stuff. I just don't think that you can keep troops ready to go in an invasion or an attacking force indefinitely. Something's got to give, and it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be an attack in some way or another, because if Trump just withdraws that armada and sends it somewhere else to create chaos and crisis, including here in the United States, but Maduro's going to sit there and crow and brag about how he faced down the big king of the world, Trump. I don't think Trump can tolerate that, and Trump knows that that's what he would do. So I think Trump has put himself in a position where he's going to have to attack. I think that's where this is going to turn out. He's hoping to strike a deal with Maduro, and maybe they'll still strike a deal, but either the deal leaves him in power, which is clearly not what Trump wants. I think Trump wants to please the opposition there. He wants to appear that, oh, I brought freedom and democracy to Venezuela. So he's put himself in a very bad position. Maybe he'll strike a deal where Maduro leaves and goes off to Spain or wherever with a few $100 million of Venezuelan taxpayer money, but we'll wait and see. In any event, that's Trump Watch for this week. I want to wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving, you and your families, and thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you for your great support of FFF. We're very honored and we're very appreciative. Happy Thanksgiving to y'all.